What's up guys, Kyle here again, and today we're gonna have a little discussion on a topic that seems to be very polarizing. Do high gain amplifiers need overdrives? Let's do it. Alright guys, hope you're doing great out there today. If this is your first time here at my channel, my name's Kyle. What I do is I take awesome high gain amplifiers, overdrives, guitars, pickups, cabs, speakers. I record them with a simple SM57 setup, and I give you the unprocessed audio on your end. If that's something you're into, hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss any of my upcoming videos. Thanks! So guys, I have kind of felt inspired to make this video based on a lot of comments that I have been getting, not only on my own videos, but comments that I've really seen popping up more lately, and it seems to be somewhat based around the 5150 Iconic, regarding do high gain amplifiers need overdrives? This is going to be more of a discussion. I'm not going to be reviewing or demoing anything in this video. I'm just going to be kind of talking to you guys and letting you know my thoughts on the subject, and then responding to your guys' comments down below after the video is over. So feel free to comment your feelings after you've watched the video. So yeah, pretty much as long as I can remember, as long as I've been a part of the gear community, it's always kind of been like this weird taboo topic of, do high gain amplifiers need overdrives? If they're a high gain amplifier, they shouldn't need any more gain. You shouldn't have to hit them with anything out front to add more gain to get the saturation level needed. If they do, the amp isn't designed right, or if you feel like you need more gain than the amp is capable of, you're doing something wrong. There's all sorts of weird stigmas around putting an overdrive in front of a high gain amplifier, and I've been getting a lot of comments, like I said recently, especially on the Iconic, where people say any 5150 amp doesn't need an overdrive. Well, in my personal opinion, there's no right or wrong answer to that, because it is completely dependent on the player, the player's taste, what the player wants from an amplifier, and if they feel that the amp is missing something, what can they add to it to get out of the amp that it's not giving them just by plugging straight into it. Now, people for ages have been doing stuff like this. They have been innovating, they have been modifying, they have been using things that aren't necessarily meant for guitar amps in general in order to get the sound that they want out of the amp, in order to get the amp to react the way that they want it to. Take, for instance, Eddie Van Halen. One of the main components of his tone, other than the man himself and the way he plays, is the variac, and dialing that voltage down to give the amp a looser feel. That is a big part of the Brown sound. Now, variacs aren't really meant for amplifiers. Who else do you see using variacs on amplifiers other than Eddie, or people trying to cop Eddie's tone from those early Van Halen albums? Van Halen? I highly doubt anyone went to Eddie and told him he was wrong for using that on his amp in order to get that tone. In fact, he's praised as an innovator for doing things like that. Fast forward a little further into the 80s, and people start using EQ pedals. They start using tube screamers and Boss SD1 pedals in front of their Marshalls or whatever amp that they have in order to increase the gain. Now, the 80s was a great time for amp innovation in general. That's where you really see the birth of a lot of the stuff that we still use today, was in the 80s. And behind that was just the drive to get more gain out of an amplifier than you could get from an amp that you bought stock off the shelf, right? So hitting the front end of a Marshall JCM 800 2204 2203 resulted in you getting more saturation from the amp, and people started having their amps modded in order to have the amp do this naturally. But other people just used the stock amp and threw a pedal in front of it, or somebody like Kerry King from Slayer, where he would throw a tube screamer in front, and then he would also push it with an MXR 10 band EQ to really hit the front end of the amp hard and add a lot of saturation that the amp was not capable of on its own. Now, I wasn't around back then, but I'm sure people had an issue with that, because you're adding solid state componentry to an all tube amp to get the sound that you want. But again, Kerry got the sound that he wanted by using that combination of items. Who's to tell him that he's wrong? In my opinion, nothing makes that wrong. So now you fast forward into the modern era of amplifiers, the 90s and 2000s. Really, we haven't seen a whole lot of innovation as far as amp tech goes since then. Maybe in the last couple of years, we started adding some cool features that weren't there before. But overall, the general voicing, the general gain capabilities of amps have pretty much been the same since the very early 90s. Amps like the Mesa Mark series, the Rectifier, obviously the SLO, and of course the PV5150, the PV Ultra series. All those amps were very capable of extremely high gain saturated tones without needing any help from any external sources. But people were still using overdrives with them. Why? Why do people use overdrives with amps that are fully capable of getting all the gain you could possibly want out of them just by plugging straight into the amp? Well, there's a couple really good reasons. Number one, it tightens the low end frequency of the amp. A lot of the times when you plug straight into a high gain amp, if you really turn that gain up to get a lot of saturation out of it, chances are the preamp will start to muddy up on that amp. It'll start to get fat. It'll add a lot of compression, and it may just kind of not be suited very well for the type of tone that you're going for just by plugging straight in. Myself personally, I like to use a decent amount of gain, but I don't like to go overboard. But even so, I would rather pull the gain back on the amp and hit the front end of it because that gives it a tighter, leaner, faster feel to me and cuts out some of those low end frequencies that are gonna kind of get in the way of faster chugging because I play in thrash metal bands. That's primarily my play style. So an overdrive really helps an amp like a 5150 or a Mesa rectifier tighten up, react faster to your right hand, and overall allow you the same level of saturation you would like to get out of it without muddying up the preamp. And that brings me to point number two. Putting an overdrive in front of a high gain amplifier is not so that it can increase the gain past what the amp is capable of on its own. One of the benefits of putting an overdrive in front of a high gain amp is that you don't have to turn the gain up as high on the front of the amp, and therefore it just kind of cleans the signal up overall. Now, of course, it all depends on the amp that you're using. It depends on the circuitry inside. But in a general statement, most high gain amps, when you put an overdrive in front of them, you can reduce the gain because you're pushing the front end of the amp a little harder. Depending on the overdrive, you're adding a little bit of clipping into, which will give a little bit more of a saturated sound. But it allows it so you can run the gain lower on the amp itself, not have to push the gain so hard on the preamp, and it just kind of overall just gives you a clearer signal. There's less compression from the preamp, and overall it just sounds a little cleaner, a little clearer hitting the front end with an overdrive as opposed to turning up the gain a couple notches on the front of the amp in order to achieve the same saturation level. So those two first points are related, but this third point is kind of something completely different, and it's my main reason for wanting to use overdrives in front of high gain amplifiers, and it is that you can use different overdrives to flavor the sound that is coming out of the amp and the cab the way that you want. I look at overdrives just the same way that I look at pickups, just the same way that I look at guitar cabs. It's just another piece of the puzzle for you to kind of fine tune and shape the tone the way that you want it. So if you're plugging into a certain amp and you're thinking, man, this really lacks some high mid aggression, what can I do to add some upper mid aggression to this amp without really changing anything, without modding anything? I don't want to go buy a whole new guitar. I don't want to go buy a whole new speaker cab or change out my speakers. There's just a little bit of something that's missing that's not there, and it doesn't require me to get a brand new guitar or a different set of pickups or a different cab. Well, you can go out and try a couple overdrives and find the one that adds what you feel is missing to your signal. And that's what I love about overdrives the most. It really is just another piece for you to kind of flavor things exactly the way that you want them to sound, depending on the guitar that I'm playing, depending on the amp, depending on the cab and speaker setup that I'm playing. I will choose different overdrives for different scenarios. It depends on the tuning as well. There are just so many different options to really fine tune and shape your tone to get it right where you want it. And for me, the overdrive has become a huge component in that equation, because this overdrive is going to sound different than this overdrive, which is going to sound different than this overdrive. All three of these are going to give you completely different voicings. They're going to give you different EQ sweeps. They're going to give you different controls and different ways to shape the tone to get it where you want it to be. On top of that, people always say, well, instead of using an overdrive, why don't you use an EQ pedal? You can absolutely use an EQ pedal if you don't want any sort of clipping introduced in your signal, or you want to shape the EQ exactly the way you want it going into the front of the amp. Neither one of these is more right than the other, and neither one of them is wrong at all. If you feel that you need to use either of these items in order to shape your tone to try to match the tone in your head, which is pretty much impossible if we're being totally honest, it's kind of like the never-ending quest among guitar nerds, there is nothing wrong about that. In fact, more and more people are using pedals to shape their tone than ever before, and that's why you're seeing a huge boom on the boutique pedal market. You're getting all sorts of new people coming into the fold, and some of them are taking designs and just tweaking them a little bit and putting their own name on it. Some of them are completely reinventing these circuits or coming out with new circuits in order to give us something completely new, something fresh. So we now have more options than ever as far as overdrives in order to shape the tone on our high gain amplifiers or low gain amplifiers, but you know, we're focused on the high gain amp thing. So really all I'm saying is there is no right or wrong way to do this thing, guys. If you want to plug directly into an amplifier and go, and you get the tone in your head or the tone that is closest to the tone in your head out of that setup, that is awesome. That's great. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I'm happy for you because you found what you were looking for and you don't need to experiment with a bunch of stuff in order to get there. You just want to grip it and rip it and go, and that works for you, and that's great. But for those of us who like to use overdrives to boost the front of an amp, to tighten it up, to give it a better feel, to revoice our signal on the way into the amplifier, to dial the gain back on the amp and let the pedal do a little bit of the work for it, there's nothing wrong with that either, man. That's what makes this whole thing so much fun. There's just so many different options. There's so many different pickups out there to voice things differently. There's so many different speakers. There's so many different cabs, different cab constructions, different cab materials, amplifiers. It doesn't matter. The whole point of this whole tone searching thing is to just experiment with a bunch of stuff until you get the closest to your sound. And nobody can tell you that your sound is right or wrong if it makes you happy. Nobody can tell you you're right or wrong if it makes you happy to put an overdrive in front of a 5150 because you like it better than without. And I really think that we as guitarists would just be a lot better served to just kind of mind our own business a lot of the time. Because one thing I've noticed from the guitar community is people are extremely tribal. They're extremely hardline on their stances for the most part, and they're not really willing to compromise on the things that they feel are correct. But what those types of people really have to realize is what's right for them isn't right for everybody. And why people dig in and kind of take this religious type stance of loving overdrives and absolutely requiring them, or saying that you shouldn't have to use them at all, and if you're using overdrives, you're doing it wrong, I'll never understand. Because in my opinion, I'm just happy to see people playing gear that they enjoy, whether they have 50 overdrives in front of their amp or 0. That's what I'm here for. So anyways, that is my talk for today. Just a little something that I kind of wanted to talk about and kind of get a conversation going down in the comments. I'm really curious to hear your guys' thoughts on this. Do you agree with anything I said? Do you disagree with everything I said? Regardless of how you feel, put it down in the comments and I'll meet you down there to chat about it. I'm really curious about the consensus on this topic. I know most of the people that I talk to really enjoy using overdrives to flavor their high gain amplifiers, but if you don't, there's nothing wrong with that. But like all things in life, just don't push what you believe on other people, and I think we'd all be better off for it. Let's have a civil discussion about gear, because in the end, we all love gear and we like playing gear, and some of us like talking to other people about gear, which is why we created YouTube channels in the first place. Hope you found this video helpful and enjoyable. If you did, hit that like button on the way out. Consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss anything else. Kyle here again. We'll see you guys next time.